Good evening, everyone. Good evening. We're going to go ahead and get started. Welcome. Good evening. My name is Scott Kratz. I'm the Vice President of Education here at the National Building Museum, and it's a pleasure to welcome you all. It's great to see such a full house. Now, to introduce tonight's speaker, I'm delighted to present Angela Adams, who will join Walter on stage for a moderated discussion later in our program. We've worked with Angela several times in several collaborations, so it's a treat to bring her back. She has worked as a curator and arts administrator for more than 25 years. She joined Arlington County in 1994 as a gallery director. In 1998, her job grew to include the development of a public art program for the county. Under her direction, Arlington Public Art has grown from one of the first private developer-based programs in the country to an internationally renowned public and privately funded program, which contributes art and design enhancements to most major civic projects. Arlington Public Art stewards a collection of more than 60 permanent artworks, initiates temporary projects, and manages more than $5 million of new public art commissions integrated into open space, buildings, and infrastructure. Prior to working for the county, she served as an adjunct curator at the National Museum of Women in the Arts here in Washington, D.C., and exhibitions director-curator for the Arlington Art Center. She's participated in public art planning throughout the region, serving on the Art Review Panel for the Maryland National Capital Parks and Planning Commission, Public Art Master Plan Advisory Committee for the D.C. Commission on Arts and Humanities, and the New York Avenue Sculpture Project Advisory Committee. Ladies and gentlemen, please welcome Angela Adams.
Thank you, Scott. It's really great to be back at the Building Museum. I was saying earlier that as an arts person, I have over the years come to many, many lectures here, and I feel like I've gotten a degree in urban design just by attending these fabulous programs. So thank you to Lafarge for your generous support of these programs. It's really been an incredible resource for me personally, and I know our community at large. I am just delighted to have Walter Hood here. Walter, as you may know, is the recipient of an Our Town grant, which we wrote and successfully received just recently. So he's here beginning to work in Arlington just tomorrow. But Walter Hood is an Oakland, California-based environmental designer, artist, and educator. He is a professor at the University of California, Berkeley Landscape Architecture and Environmental Design Department, which he chaired from 1998 to 2002. His studio practice, Hood Design, has been engaged in environmental design, urban design, art installations, and research commissions since 1992. Hood works in the urban civic realm from small community-based places to large-scale landscape commissions. His studio recently completed a 1.1 megawatt photovoltaic array within the campus landscape at the University of Buffalo, the new Powell Street Promenade in San Francisco, which recently awarded an ASLA Honor Award, and the new sculpture terrace for the Jackson Museum of Wildlife Art in Wyoming. Hood Design was also responsible for the gardens and landscape of the Herzog and Demerin designed DeYoung Museum in San Francisco. Earlier projects located in Oakland, such as Lafayette Square and Splash Pad Park, are regarded as transformative designs in the field of landscape architecture. As a matter of fact, I happen to know that Splash Pad Park prompted a mayor's proclamation establishing Walter Hood Day in Oakland. No small stuff. Hood was appointed as the inaugural holder of the David K. Wu Chair in Environmental Design at UC Berkeley in 2013. He has also served as a Goldman Sachs Design Fellow for the Smithsonian Institute and an MIT Fellow for the Robert Taylor in 2011, and was the 2009 recipient of the Cooper Hewitt National Design Award for Landscape Design. He has exhibited and lectured on his professional projects and speculative works internationally. I also know that he happens to be working on a book, which he will hopefully tell us more about his unique approach and making distinct and memorable public spaces. Thank you, Walter.
Thanks a lot, Angela, for that illustrative introduction. It's always a pleasure to be back here in D.C. because D.C. has a place in my heart. This is my first job out of college, was here. And Darwina Neal is in the audience, and she's one of the first master landscape architects that I met. And I got to really learn landscape architecture here, and then I left after 12 months. It's a joke. Tonight, I'd like to not speak directly about one project, but about a set of ideas. It's been like 20 years now since I started my practice and since I've been teaching. And one of the characteristics I would think of my practice has been I've always tried to sort of locate myself within the tradition in which I'm participating, meaning landscape architecture, architecture, urban design. As a Southern African American, having gone to an all-black undergraduate university and having that Southern experience and finally moving up to the North, I was confronted with a lot of issues of self, and how do I begin to represent some of those things, those values and attitudes that define me and define the place and the people that I came from. And it took about 15, 20 years before I really got comfortable in my own skin. And I'd like to thank all the people who sort of allowed me to ask other questions about the work. And I think if we start to sort of question how we go about our practice, we should get somewhere different. I don't think in this country we should all end up in the same place, because we all have different backgrounds and we come from different circumstances. So tonight I'd like to talk a little bit about this notion of a conscious and unconscious hybrids. And I'm stealing this from linguistics, the way in which we can think about language and place. A first set of projects I'm going to argue that we worked on for the first decade were conscious hybrids. We were very interested in this ironic double consciousness that typologies and landscapes set up for us. And I mean very simple. When you start a project, you look at an RFP and it says a park. You go to the place and no one questions whether it should be a park. You see that it might need other ingredients, so you're constantly trying to put those ingredients in this defined typology, which is a park. At the end of the day, people come to the meeting, and if it doesn't have a picnic table, lawns, and trees, you're fired. We want a park. And so this notion of questioning, this idea, we approached it through the hybrid. And we tried to string along typology after typology and put them together to try to find that disruption or that double consciousness. That collision between those different points of views, I would argue, again, in our work, creates a kind of a strangeness to the work. That you go like, something seems really different, because those typologies don't really belong together. And for us, fusing the unfusable becomes this way of having a voice within the public realm. The unconscious hybrid kind of emerged out of this work. And it's this notion that you don't disrupt the sense of order and continuity, and that through new words, new images, new objects can be integrated and can unfold. So you don't start somewhere, you allow accretion to happen. It happens over time, it happens through exchange. And those historical foundations are built in a way to shock people, to really get people to see things differently. And I'm going to show two sets of projects over this journey that hopefully will explain what I mean by these terms. This first project is just now 20 years old. It's Cortlandt Creek. It's in Oakland, California. It's a public right-of-way, about 60 feet wide, and I was asked to design a park there. It was an old railroad right-of-way, 40 feet wide, and they wanted a park. They wanted a park because it had a creek next to it. Here. I was employed by environmental planners, and I immediately went out and I said, this should not be a park. I'm more interested in the street. So we decided to layer on a street alley into what they wanted it to be, was this park. We didn't touch the creek. And the idea, by layering these hybrids, the alley next to the street, next to the creek, again, you get these ironic doubles, where things are not clear or they're very clear. So when it's built, then, you get something very strange. You get a sidewalk made of gravel. There's the only gravel sidewalk in Oakland. You get pieces emerging from the ground. There's a pipe that carries the water underground. You get 150 trees in 2 blocks as street trees, which again is not something you normally see. And you actually get houses that are now fronted by something more formal versus something informal. This project was key for us because the things that it did, it changed the social behavior of the street. People were used to seeing dumping, an abandoned creek, and all of a sudden they saw trees that they had to water, and every year, 150 trees turning pink is pretty powerful. And for the first 5 years, they would call up and go, the trees are pink. And I would say within a decade, most of the people who lived here, which were lower income, were able to actually sell their houses because this was during the big economic sort of turn in California, and the houses actually gained value. This was one of the really hard, drug-stricken streets, and now it's a street where people can walk safely through this double row of trees. And I think over 20 years, we've lost maybe less than a dozen, which, is amazing in East Oakland. This next project is in Macon, Georgia. And again, these are old graphics, but they were trying to show this hybrid. Macon, Georgia is a city of streets. They're 180 feet wide. I went there thinking it was a city of squares, and it wasn't. So we made squares. So again, we forced the typology of the square, which is a southern typology, into the street, and then revealed things that maybe people didn't want to talk about. And through that history, we were able to sort of understand the political history as well as the social history. But some of these, again, these double negatives, these things that were pushing against each other, like white and black. Like Macon is a city that race has always been up front since day one. You brought your cotton to town. Slaves stacked the cotton, put them on a train, and took them out. The topo, it falls 45 feet within 3 city blocks. It's the gnat line. It's where you don't get gnats there. It's the fall line. It's between the Piedmont Plateau and the coastal plain. So all of these things were very relevant as we started designing. And then we found out that the alleys had this amazing history where there were cockfighting and all these really good things happened in alleys. And so we tried to make these connections. Right? And so at the end of the day, the project, again, through this sort of double consciousness, it makes the obelisk to the Daughters of the Confederacy a centerpiece, which was once before kind of hidden in the back. Because if you go up and read it, you understand what the Daughters of the Confederacy is all about. And then we shined it up with water and connected it to cotton bales that then talked about that dichotomy. And the cotton bales are tables. And made it a really formal landscape where this object had the power because the Capitol building or the county building is right here. And that, again, this history is very relevant. You go to Norfolk, Virginia, there's actually a statue with the Confederate flag, right? And it's funny seeing people stand there and it's invisible. So all we're trying to do is make things visible to people so they understand their place. And then underground, we found an 80-inch wide sewer that was running stormwater, and we actually brought water to the top. And so again, through these different juxtapositions of things, the typology allow them not to sort of become congruent, but to stand side by side. And it's up to you to sort of think about what it means. And they sort of emerge from a different time and place. Closer to home, this is Splash Pad Park. This is a different typology because it is a typology that was developed culturally. People called it Splash Pad Park. It was not named that way formally. There was a giant piece of water that flew up that the commercial community built that never worked, and then people went there and they immediately called it a park because it sits next to Lake Merritt, which is a huge park. We were hired to actually do traffic mitigation, to get people to cross the street here safely and get to the park. Our first meeting, we ended up with 150 people, and everyone wanted a park. Different kinds of parks, dog parks, public parks. Only one group wanted plazas, and they wanted to be like Times Square. This was a fallow interchange next to a high-speed freeway. So people were wanting something that didn't exist only in their minds. So we changed it into a hybrid park, plaza, square, and street, and they all go on together. We removed the street, left its history, paved an area, but made sure when you're in the paved area looking out, you always see green. And that is very powerful to people wanting the park. And now, on Saturdays, we're in our 10th anniversary, and every Saturday, those typologies go away, it fills up with people, and it becomes one of the largest markets in Northern California for produce, entertainment, etc. The website is splashpadpark.com. But if you go there, you can find out when you get good neck massages, when they have the tango night. There's all kinds of things happening under a freeway. The garden has been taken over now by the local school kids, and now it's a native garden. And when you look out, you see that as a piece of sculpture underneath the freeway, when there's no one there, it still has a life. And so again, these hybrids come together in these unexpected ways, not in the normal way. So when you look at that, you don't really go park. You don't really go plaza. This next one is Lafayette Square Park. And again, it's a hybrid that's created culturally. It was a historic square. Oakland had 7 of them. Early part of the 20th century, those 7 squares were being used by undesirables. So what was the first thing they did? They planted them. So they were hard paved and they all became green. And they were planted by the Women's Auxiliary Club, they were planted by Park and Rec in different places. And before the middle of the century, they became these very simple parks like we have all over the country with an X, right? And you move from one end to the other. And this is social control. You can control people. You move them across, you can't stop, no program. In this case, the brothers stopped right in the middle by the big oak tree, and it became the place that they inhabited. And so probably for 40 years, the middle of the park then was this place where old men came to hang out. And most people couldn't walk through the middle because it was the gauntlet. If you walked through the middle, you might get something taken, or it just looked really scary seeing all those guys there. So we redesigned it in the mid-90s to, again, talk about the hybridity of the plaza, the park, and the square, and all of these things commingled together. And then in the end, you get a large space, which when it won an award at Places, Randy Hester and Laurie Olin said this was one of the few projects that they've seen that turned their education on its head. They were talking about when they were educated, I guess in the 60s, that people were into the kumbaya moment, right? It was all about being together. This is about being apart. You can go here, and there's some brothers over here yelling, things. You can sit over here comfortably and have a nice space. So it's not about being together. It's about people finding their place within the different typologies. On any morning now, you'll go there and people are doing Tai Chi here. Guys are sitting over here near the bathroom playing music, and someone's over here cooking on a grill. But it allows those different places. And within 1.5 acres, you can actually compress, again, these typologies into something that's more than the single one. This next project is in Golden Gate Park, San Francisco. This is looking back towards the west. And when we first started this project in San Francisco, people asked me, Walter, are you going to make a native garden for the museum? And I thought about that, and then I looked at the history, and this is what it would look like. These would be sand dunes, because the Pacific Coast comes right up against San Francisco, and from the east, it's constantly bringing its mineral content and changing that edge. Olmsted, I don't know if this is true, when he came out, he was like, this is one of the harshest landscapes. You should do a promenade on one of your east-west streets. And of course, McLaren, like in New York, saw this as a great opportunity to expand the city westerly. And so the park then became this edifice of fill, because most of it's sand and you need dirt for trees to grow. And so a lot of the hills around the area were cut down and this area was filled, and it was a bucolic park was created. And it took about 100 years to mature to its fruition. And now when people come there, they actually think it's been there all along. The history of the area that we're working in, as you can see, early 20th century to late 20th century, 60s. A lot of these buildings have changed now. These came down during Loma Prieta, and this was just redesigned. Working with Herzog and Dimero, we thought about how could we say something about the park in a prophetic way that got people to sort of see where they were. And they were very interested in getting people to see the city through the museum. And so when you go up to the tower in the museum, the tower actually twists. And so you start in the park in one orientation, and by the time you get to the top, you're in the city's orientation. So they were really about trying to locate the museum in time and space. And what we then said was, we'll riff off of that, and can we think about the park and the museum as a place to see the park more keenly? So we sampled most of the plant material within a quarter mile around from the park, because most of it was given to the park or given to the city. And so we had gardens like eucalyptus courts, fern courts, we have 2 gardens. And again, how do you bring these typologies together in a way that isn't, how can I say, seamless? And so what we decided to do was each side of the building, the landscape pushed up and pulled away in different ways. And so we ended up treating each side differently, trying to understand, could it become one thing just through experience, not through aesthetics? And so as the landscape then pushes and pulls, the visitor then has a different way to sort of understand the park. And from the children's garden, the landscape is literally enmeshed here with history, the pool of enchantment, lots of spaces to move. We imported fog just to get, a different feeling in this space before the kids went in to be educated. Yeah? And then the front becomes that plaza, which we know is on top of a parking garage, where we ironically put 120-year-old palm trees on top that we actually saved. So again, allowing different conversations in different ways to say different things. And then by the time we get to the sculpture garden, James Turrell's piece allows this kind of middle garden to sort of push in and for us to pull in the park and the Japanese tea garden. And we were able to actually find brothers and sisters of the maple trees that were growing here. We actually went to the nursery and found them and pushed them across so they looked like they were always there. And so again, when you see this landscape, it looks strange. It doesn't look like the corporate landscape. It has a different sort of edge to it. There's edges that are sharp and frayed. The ground is a kaleidoscope. You're constantly looking down. And this idea that sand is beneath your feet, it was less of the metaphor, but getting people just to look down. And then in certain areas, bringing back the kind of the revelatory landscape of what existed before. And working with artists such as Andy Goldsworthy and James Turrell, really, again, trying to have a moment to discuss material, the ground, and geology. And again, we talked a lot about putting heavy pieces of stone over space that floats. So you walk through here and you actually think it's the ground, but it's actually not the ground. You can actually move up and down, and you'll actually move the ground because this is all on styrofoam. And then Andy, in his whimsy, made a crack. And the fern gardens inside, again, begin to talk about the environment. And most people think these are native ferns, the same that you would see in Marin, but these come from Australia. They were actually given to the city from Australia, and there's a huge Australian tree fern garden a block away. So for us, making these different decisions, not as one large thing, but based on those typologies, allowed things to come together in a way that wasn't seamless, but at the time seemed to be relevant to the conversation about how the museum was being located in the park and how people saw the park. When the museum was placed in the park, the citizens of San Francisco actually sued the museum because it was a park. When things go into the park, they're really hard to put in the park because it's a park, right? To put a museum in a park, oh, it's controversial. To close a street in the park, to put a car in a park is controversial. But it was a sand dune, right? And so again, this way in which we talk about the construction of nomenclature and how it has meaning over time, I think as a designer, sometimes it handcuffs us and it doesn't allow us to sort of move further into the speculative. And there's that view looking out where you don't know where the park begins or the garden begins. So along the way in doing this work, I met a really close friend now, Mary Jane Jacobs, and she invited me to the Art Institute in Chicago. And this was like in 2003 and 2004. And that was a fruitful period of time where I was able to actually get out of the landscape and get back into the gallery and get back into the workshop. And we started having these discussions, about how can the work these things that we know be very powerful. And over the last few years, we've done a few installations. This first one I showed you was a bioline, and it was a project that looked at this machined filter that runs in the Louis Sullivan Garden, and we were doing an exhibit on the Bauhaus, and Bauhaus talks about, landscape, it talks about craft and all of these things, and I looked around, and here was this machine thing running through this beautiful building. So we immediately grafted this bioline on top with these epiphytes so that the sculpture actually became the machine. Right? Or the giant horse in the room in the Peralta Hacienda that speaks and tells the stories of immigrants who came to California. But these projects for us became ways of getting out of the typology or the typological realm. And over time, I began to ask different questions then about the work and the objects. And it became less about that defined typological space, but the more about events happening in space and how spaces can actually become greater fields of landscape. And I think that's a very relevant conversation today with landscape urbanism and infrastructure projects, that the typology limits our imagination to a certain degree because we're focused in. But once we move out into the field and we lose those words, right, or we lose the nomenclature, it might allow us to see different things. And so Richard White down in Stanford, I was on a plane coming in the Bay Area, and I was looking out over the salt ponds, and I remember him saying, we do not have a name for their conjunctive beauty, these new hybrid landscapes. And some environmental historians think that the hybrid landscape is probably the most plentiful of all the landscapes around us. It's not the design landscapes, it's those unconscious landscapes, those things that have blurred together, like fisheries, like salt ponds. I don't know how many times I'm on a plane with people flying in, oh, look at the bay, isn't that beautiful? It's all red and green. But you can imagine if these were wetlands, people would like, what is that? It's not familiar to them, right? So again, there's something about the landscapes that we've made because they say a lot about us. Right? And so these next projects then try to deal with not the typology, but us in a way that forces us maybe to see the landscape in a different way. Here's a project, I'm not going to name the city that we're working in. This project is still in proposal form, but it's about integrating voices about segregation and integration. There was a state in the union that decided not to integrate after the Brown versus the Board of Education, and they called this thing massive resistance, and the entire state resisted integrating. And a public art project, actually, an RFQ was put out. We want to commemorate massive resistance. And I was like, wow, that sounds interesting. What is massive resistance? So we started researching, and there are these amazing archives now that exist in Norfolk State, Old Dominion, through personal interviews, and through television that talk about that time. We were also interested in the site. It's a new federal and state building, light rail, and a new plaza, but we weren't quite interested in the plaza. So we started thinking about, well, what does it mean to integrate and to segregate? And we started thinking about swarming and different sort of complex behaviors of groups. And the idea for us became, can we get people to come to a space and to actually mix, but mix in a way that was almost like swarming, right? That if there was an action, there would be another reaction from the group, and slowly it would make space. Let's see if this works. So the idea for us very early on was taking points in space, and could we actually then make an architecture that would force people then to be closer together, but to act differently through this object. Right? And that object was really about the swarm. Could we get people to come to this space and act in different ways based on something? And that something became sound for us. And the piece is very simple. These are very known things. It's a tensegrity structure, and it's two sets of whispering benches. Right? And the tensegrity structure is anodized black and anodized white, and there are these sticks thrown up in the air to give you gray. Right? And at the end, there's a speaker. And our proposal went like this. We would go into K5, and we would take our archives, and we would work with teachers, and kids today would actually read the word between 1958 and 1968. And some of the quotes and some of the words of the day are pretty profound of how people felt. The young kids, some of the things they said was amazing. Edward R. Murrow goes down. It's like, I'm Edward R. Murrow, and I'm down here to see what's going on with massive resistance. How do you kids feel? And the kids are like, we feel great. We're having a good time. It was their parents that were having the bigger issues. But every one of the interviews with the kids, it was really telling that, they were, whatever, we need to go to school. But they both lost a year. And so what we decided to do then is set up these spaces where you would have the stick, someone would come in.
The Gray Commission can study this
One
matter
legal
for
child
10 years
is
and they can
sound
come up
start.
with only one answer.
That
That is to say that if schools are operated with public funds, Negro children can go to them with white children. I'd rather see the schools abolished.
children to white tuition and paid for by the taxes levied on me and every
Integration
other
takes
parent
place
in the
only when
city.
these children
As a white
enter
mother and
into all
Christian, I
activities
want
of the
to be
program
counted
of the
as
school.
And these would be at varying heights and levels of sound, and as people moved away, the sound would go away. And that would be this cacophonic thing that would happen as people moved through this public space. And it would actually happen again in the bench. I'm not going to go through that, but you would have the same kind of triangulation that would happen. You move through a space, you stop to listen, and someone goes, well, what's that person doing? And they come over and they listen. Before you know it, you might have tea and coffee, right? Or you might find out your brothers and sisters or something, right? And then that view, on a normal day, it just looks like a normal kind of art piece you might see in a plaza in a downtown area. This next project is down in San Francisco, California, and it's Poplar Street. And this is one of the richest, densest areas in San Francisco. On the weekend, I think the quote is about 30 to 35,000 people come here. And we wanted to make this parklet, which is part of this program, something that would just disappear in this landscape. Right? Most of the parklets in California or in San Francisco are made of wood, they're recycled, they're doing the hip thing of something, and we decided, well, what should we do? And we walked around and looked at the sidewalk, and we walked around and took photographs. And there's so much steel and metal in sidewalks, right, between grates and things. And so we ended up working for Audi, the car company, and we actually fabricated everything within this parking lot out of aluminum. So everything kind of score morphs out of the aluminum to put people closer, right, to the street. And that experience then becomes something, again, I think part of the city. It's less about the street, less about the sidewalk. And it's much more about this larger space. Because again, it doesn't just stop and say, I'm framing this, I'm only about this. And it's very akin to this project. I show them both. This is at the large scale and this at the small scale. But they both try to kind of push at the things that we know. Whether it's this super elevated thing where I'm speeding at like 80 miles an hour, right? Or this public street here, that I can actually be in that space. Here, where 30,000 people, whether I'm in the Tenderloin or a tourist, I can find a place to begin to sort of view the action. And moving back to the East Coast, Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania, again, very early, thinking about the history of the place. The Hill District is the place we were working. It's actually a set of 7 hills. And understanding its history over time, we were able to see the landscape as something, not of a typology of freeways and neighborhoods, but as one thing. And at the end of the day, one of the revelatory pieces for us was this acknowledgement of people who lived in the Hill, moved around the Hill like everyone else in Pittsburgh, through stairs. That you can look at all of these other images of history, but at the end of the day, you talk to people, and this was their home. Oh, you go up, turn right, climb the stairs, and that's where we are. And neighborhoods in Pennsylvania, they actually have books that describe their stairs. And the Hill didn't. Why? Because lower income, people, African American, all of these issues, disinvestment, et cetera, et cetera. But it's one of the, I find, one of the most richest sort of neighborhoods culturally, and also through its landscape. And so we ended up with the green print. We were asked to do a trail, and we ended up with a 1,000-acre green print. And the trail was entitled Find the Rivers. And for us, that was a kind of a no-brainer. The rivers are there, right? But this big, soft donut in between the two rivers was actually what's more important. That through the disinvestment that's happened, this emergent landscape now has shown people in the community why they're there. That this is the central core. These two rivers created this big green thing. And so the resilience come against the river of having that big wild buffer in between. And so the entire green print is based on then codifying how do you build in the woods. And we actually talked about the woods. Not the woodlands, we said the woods. And the woods means something to people. Sometimes it means scary, sometimes it means dangerous, but it also means it's very familiar to people. The woods, it's dark. It's not as dense. You move through the woods in a different way. And then the center was called the village. And within the village, you make things differently as well. And again, not putting things back to the park, like that big green donut is not a park, it's a wood. And we're still working with them because they want to call it a park. They still, because it's really hard to see this as one thing. So we just had the grand opening of the green print, and it was for a park. And I was invited, and the congressman and senator was there, and I just stood up and said, well, you might want to call this a park, but you have to understand it's part of the woods. Because if you don't see the woods, the park will never become. It'll just be another typology and a postage stamp. And so we went out, instead of doing the final presentation, we went out and actually mapped the trail, which was existing because these kids made it. And then we did the presentation on the police station. And people came to the hill and stopped, which was something I hadn't seen happen in a couple years while we were working there. This next project, I think I'm almost going to wrap up in a minute, is in Buffalo. It was mentioned. And this is, again, an unconscious hybrid. We were asked, along with two other artists, to come up with a plan to do a solar array. And actually, I think they call it a solar park at the University of Buffalo. And the University of Buffalo sits outside of downtown, and it basically scarified an old agriculture field, moved a creek, and then they built a campus. They found a space about 15 acres here at one end, on the south end, and after the state had given them 5,000 PV panels, 3 by 5, they placed them in this landscape, and evidently the president came by and was not happy with seeing 5,000 PV panels sitting out there. And the campus architect then held a competition, and we ended up winning the competition for that. And after going through an extreme analysis on the site, this became the gestalt. We wanted to basically fix the dirt and capture the energy. Because the dirt had been scarified in the floodplain, where probably the highest area of green and wildlife actually existed to the edge of the campus where no one could get there. And so this was our diagram from the competition, and we basically said that we would like to sort of tap into that patch ecology and bring it into the project site by making new patches. And these patches would be created by just digging holes, because you dig holes and you find water. And the Strand then became a way to think about this landscape, not the park. And the Strand goes back to these kind of vertical landscapes, but they also begin to talk about this new identity that we were trying to forge. And so we had 3 main proposals. One, they go in and they create these new patches that could work with a larger set of patches. Based on a DNA signature, we were able to lay out the panels in a way that codified how much energy was actually being sent to different residences. And then lastly, on the way, working with Al Gilowitz, the power plant manager, we've changed the entire mowing regiment of the South Campus, which is huge. Which is huge. I mean, to change the mowing regiment, amazing, you know? And so we codified that, again, through very simple drawings. You can actually go online, UBC solar array, and you can actually see the kilowatt hours actually being fed to the dormitories. It's live, it's action. This project has really galvanized the entire campus to actually think about the campus landscape in a different way. And that's come from a park that was supposed to be a solar park. And so it was built a year and a half ago, and the panels went in, the strands went in. It goes a 1/4 mile. They ended up at the end of the day having 3,700 panels. It's a very strange thing in this landscape. You can actually see the mowing regiment actually taking on. And I say this for a reason. They stopped mowing and we let things go. And we actually have the most beautiful weeds. I think the designer, the landscape architects, very early in this project wanted to replace all the topsoil, which would have cost millions and millions of dollars. And so we just let everything go because the highway department had started it already. And they ended up finding like 37 to 40 different species of different plants here. And it's just great watching the birds soar and come down. But it's actually growing into this unconscious hybrid where 2 years ago on Earth Day, the students were like, how can we get involved? So we had them start to plant trees to make the strands. And then within the changing season, you get this other place. And through the mowing regiment, I know I've said it 4 times, students now can actually walk to school, not on the sidewalks, but through the weeds and next to this new array. And they branded it, and I think they call it the solar array. I think they call it the solar array. And now they got bike share there. We've reused all the concrete as buildings come down, it's completely green. Some of the programs going on there fills the new gathering space, right, in this stranded landscape. And people come from all over and they bring the most interesting things. I have no idea what's going on in this picture, but it's really great to see that you can be at an array with animal skins, right? Unexpected, love it. But this idea then that this new identity can begin to change, again, how people live in this area, but how people sort of operate daily. And I think the solar array becomes emblematic of that. Okay, the last project I'll show as part of these unconscious hybrids is the Jackson Wildlife Museum. If you go to Jackson Hole, you land, you come into the hole, which is where the glacier actually slid through, and it makes this beautiful moraine. The elk come in and they bugle. Tourists can take coach rides in this beautiful flat landscape. It's one of those places, after reading John McPhee, I'm like, I can't do anything in this landscape. I mean, you're just helpless. I mean, it's amazing. But we won a competition to go and do a wildlife trail for this museum. And this is a museum by Kurt Fentress that's patterned on an old Scottish ruin. And he's so good at designing it that most people just never saw it and just went right by it. So they built this big parking lot then for people. They get a couple million of people during the summer come through. And I was blown away that I could go all the way to Jackson to see this. Every summer they were making blacktop. And it gets really dry and hot here. But the car was paramount. You came in and drove right to the front, and you came out this way. And they even raffled cars in this landscape, right? And this is your experience. You came up, you parked, you saw the guy, the fake guy bugling, and then you looked out here to see if you could find the real guys bugling. It was a pretty weird place. For me coming there to experience that landscape in a car, and every time we would come, we would drive up, and people would be sitting in their car, drinking a Budweiser, looking at the view. And here you are in this amazing landscape. And so it's like, how do you get people out? And for them, they wanted to do a trail, and the trail would go next to the parking lot because it's a typology, and you would put these things here and people would see the landscape. So my first thing I said when I went there was, you cannot mention the word trail the entire time we're working. And they were like, what do you mean? You just can't say trail. And so for 2 years, they didn't say trail. And when people said trail, they said, you can't say trail, Walter's here, right? But this was the inspiration. This is a beautiful Donald Judd installation, right, up on the terrace. But this was one of the most powerful pieces to me when I went there one day, because it made me see this landscape, right? Seeing those lines made that come alive. And I was reminded by, Wallace Stevens' Antidote to a Jar and these other analogies about the thing. And so we took it on to change their entire visitor experience. Over 5 years, we convinced them to get rid of a third of the cars. We convinced them you cannot arrive at the front. You should go out in the landscape here and then come back to the building. We tried to deal with all of these issues of experiencing that landscape. And after it was built, this was the picture that they posted on their website. Right? So now you can go there in the morning and do yoga. Who knew? And you don't see any cars, and that moraine is always there, right? And so again, not paying attention to the thing at hand, but trying to harness this. Now the entryway where you used to be dropped off is now an amphitheater where they can sell things. They end the 10K race here. There's all kinds of things that go on in the landscape that was always there. And then when you sit out there, it's just pretty mind-blowing that you don't have cars. And cars are right below the edge. You just can't see them because we push the terrace out so that you can't see down. Right? And again, putting people in the landscape in a very different way. And what's happened over time then over the last 2 years is changing. Their programs are changing because they see the landscape in a different way. And they call every now and then saying we're doing this, but we've done our job. I hope it transforms into something that I could never imagine. And in closing, I hope I've been clear about this idea between the conscious and the unconscious. The editing of nomenclature, I think, within design helps a lot, meaning to not make assumptions that this is the right thing to do, but to question these things. But the bigger question is, within the 21st century and as we move forward, wanting our cities to look alike or to look different is going to be the big question. We're still basing a lot of ideas on colonial ideas. How do we get to the point where we actually really see this country? And I think a lot of things like climate change, I think changing demographics of places are beginning to force us to look closely at where we live. And I was thinking at the end of writing this piece on conscious hybrids and unconscious hybrids, wouldn't it be great if you could go to a landscape or place and the landscapes look like the way people talked, right? So you went to California, and the landscapes were all like, yo, dude, what's up, man? They were all laid back, everything was kind of just beautiful, right? Or you go to New York, and everything's just cranked out. Or you come to DC, and it's a little southern, it's a little northern, and nothing gets done, and everybody's just hanging out, right? But if we thought of landscapes in the same way, like the places, I think it would force us, though, to make different decisions about it. And again, the conscious and the unconscious hybrids tries to get at that. It begins to get at, we are somewhere. If you live in a marsh, right, your world should be about a marsh. Because in the summer times, it's going to let you know it's a marsh, right? But if you sort of keep forgetting it's a marsh, when it becomes a marsh, it blows you away. Right? I was here 3 years ago when the air conditions went down, and I was blown away. I was like, it's 110 degrees, and all the water's hot, and it ain't getting cool. Thank you, guys. Did I leave enough time for you?
Perfect.
Thanks. What do we do now? Sit?
We're going to sit, we're going to talk, we're going to have a conversation. I've got a few ideas to get us started, and hopefully we'll open this up as soon as possible because there's a lot of really interesting people in this room, just the few I know, so I know there are a lot of interesting questions. So Walter, I want to talk a little bit about NOC, what we brought you here to do through the Our Town grant. Since its inception in the late 70s, when we commissioned Nancy Holt to design what became known as Dark Star Park, Arlington Public Art, as our approach to our projects has been one of integration. We see public art as a vital tool for promoting design excellence and creating a high-quality public realm. My view is that public art is an essential element of placemaking and that civic design, and it can be a major contributor to shaping and enhancing the built environment. As you know, we were recently awarded the Our Town grant, and we'll be having you come to NOC, which is a community a little north of Shirlington. Shirlington and Arlington is near 395, near our border with Alexandria, and it's an area that's gotten a lot of investment lately, public-private investment. But NOC is a traditionally African-American community, about 4,000 or so residents, and although it's been going through a good bit of planning, effort on part of the county to revitalize the community. There's really not been a there. There's been, as you know, you had a quick visit last week to the site, some land that's been purchased with this town square idea. The community has gone through, again, a series of processes to get us to this point of being ready to have you come. But we were purposefully vague in our grant to the NEA. We wanted you to consider wearing both hats, the hats that you wear so beautifully, both as a practicing artist and as a landscape architect. And I was wondering if you could tell us a little bit about what your approach might be to knock, and what were your initial impressions. I think one of the things that caught my attention in your conversation just now is this idea of reflecting how people talk in the landscape. And I think there's a lot of stories that want to be told in knock. So I'm curious to hear a little bit about what you thought.
Well, last week when I came, just like most site visits, I expected a different place. I expected it to be clean and defined, because I kept town square so much. It's like, okay, it's got to be a town square or something, and it doesn't exist. But I was pleasantly surprised that there were people. And it's funny that I say I'm pleasantly surprised, because you go a lot of places that people want to do something, and there's no people, right? So I was taken by that. But I've always been taken by the story, at least what little story I know. Freedman Village, most of them in this country don't exist anymore. They only exist in paper. An interesting period of time during Reconstruction that most people don't know about, have any idea about, from the East Coast all the way to Oklahoma. I think they stretch that far. But then the kind of the insight of someone to actually be truly a capitalist at that time of the same persuasion to actually purchase a tract of land. I find that I'm just very curious about that, because you can't see that. And then talking to some of the people there seemed to be maybe an 80-year break, and then kind of seeing people reflect on the last 30 years and who's very important. There was a gentleman people talked about who was a caretaker, I'm just sort of paraphrasing, for the park. He was there every day, and people knew him by being there, and then he passed away. And they actually held his wake in the space, which I've never heard of before. And people came while the body lay in wake in this space. It's very powerful, right? And so beginning to sort of think about then that period of time and what that really means, I'm really interested in taking that line of inquiry. The other aspect of it, the landscape is beautiful. And again, not being able to sort of say anything about being up on that bluff. I mean, that's something that's really powerful, I would imagine, at that time. And still today, to stand there looking and you could actually see the ridges out there, it's really powerful. But again, getting stuck in the typology forces you not to see all of those things. And then having to talk with the police while we were there and talking to some of the gentlemen to see the problems with the typology. And so one of the things I'm going to try to do is implode the typology. Because I don't want people to be banned anymore. Some interesting rules. You can actually be banned from parks, right? Three attempts, you're banned. Any park. So if you got rid of the park, can you be banned? Right? I mean, so it's this idea, but I just find it really strange. You can be banned, wow. But there's all of these interesting synergies around how do you construct neighborhood? How do you maintain them? How do you maintain this kind of normative behavior? And the normative behavior is being viewed through the lens of the type, right? And again, if we free that, right? If someone's acting a certain way and they're in the woods, you would have a completely different view versus on the lake, versus the thing. So I'm really interested in kind of pushing that and talking to neighbors about that. But I think our first conversation was I was really taken by the landscape, the setting, and how all the pieces sit in that landscape, and is there another way to think of how they, I don't want to use the term connected, but how they relate to one another and how one experiences those relationships.
So I have a kind of a follow-up question. I remember reading a piece about you in Metropolis magazine in 2005, and I was very taken by everything I read. You talk about cultural landscapes and this idea of trying to uncover, make things visible. We talked about it today. Bringing back what existed before. Again, allowing things to come together. The other thing you said, and you also said this when I heard you speak here one time, is you like your landscapes, or you like your landscape architecture, or you like your open spaces messy.
Yeah.
But there's nothing in your work, your finished work, that says messy to me. I know what you mean.
Yeah.
Tell us about that.
Well, they're not clean, definable products. They're not things you can go to and go, oh, he did that because of this, and did that because of this. You know, some of them are contradictions. Some of them are things we don't like talking about. Some of them are in your face. I mean, we just did a piece on 7th Street where we did a big armature over the road, and we put Malcolm X up, Martin Luther King, side view, Maya Angelou, I'm forgetting now, all the black heroes. Who? Obama, thank you. But we put them over the street, and it's interesting the conversations I have with blacks who live in the neighborhood versus people who don't live in the neighborhoods. And that, to me, is messy to a certain degree. And I use the term in a more liberal way, and again, it's kind of pushing against the normative way in which we make things. We want to know exactly what they mean, and I have the hardest time with clients because they want to know exactly why you're doing that. And it's like, I don't know, but I'm compelled to do it at this point in time. So, but messiness is, our lives is messy. Life is messy. And we're always trying to project that it's clean and that we're together. When I'm not around you guys, I'm a mess, right? I mean, you're trying to put it together, and I would rather be in those kinds of spaces that are constantly, shifting and changing and not clearly defined. So that's what I mean by that.
You sound like an artist to me. So one last question. You did talk a little bit about our mutual friend Mary Jane Jacob. You did an invited MFA not too long ago, following up on your Master's in Architecture degree and other architecture experience you told me as well. What on earth would drive you to go and seek even an invited MFA? I mean, why? And we talked a little bit also about your practice and about this intentional idea of having an art side and a landscape design side. And one of the things I'm finding in the field is that you do need both sets of skills, especially in the work that I do in public art, and we often are finding it in someone like you. Right. But what does compel you? And how, speaking of hybrids and dichotomies, I mean, how do you reconcile those? I mean, how do you know when to pull from one bag or the other bag of tricks?
You don't. My thesis was on kind of the practical and speculative, right, way in which one might work, right? Because practice sets you up for this kind of clear beginning and ending. And if you don't get there, you get fired and there are consequences. I mean, artists can stay in the ether forever, right? I mean, they can just stay there. But there are these moments of bifurcation that I talk a lot about and try to practice a lot. There are these moments where you can get off that linear ride and just go out there because you're asking different questions. And I found that within the singular practice, I wasn't allowed to ask those questions. And it's nothing, back to the professions of architecture, landscape architecture, and urban design, but they are very narrowly drawn professions. And some of the things I wanted to ask or even engage in just wasn't possible until I met Mary Jane. And I met her, she invited me to a festival in Spoleto. And I'm just going to get to the end. We grew rice. It's a great installation. We grew rice. But it was so profound the way we grew rice, I'm from North Carolina. I knew nothing. I mean, I knew they were called geeches, but I didn't know why. It's because all the rice down there. But Carolina gold was this amazing crop that transformed South Carolina. And to be able to talk with people about the landscape in that way was something very new and powerful. And to work with Ernesto Pujo, Ms. Whitehead, and some of the others who work with us, I had never worked in such a speculative way, and then got it done, right? It's like, it got done, and it was transformational. And then through those conversations, doing installation work all over the place with her as curator, it just became a clear venue for the work that I was doing. She saw it in my work prior to that, so evidently there was something that I was doing that was compelling to her. And she's really allowed, you know, everybody needs a curator, you know, I mean, really, because the best curators, you know, they have their hand on your back, and they just keep pushing you. And you don't know where you're going, but they're pushing you. But you don't know they're there most of the time. They're invisible. And I think good curators do that for you.
Different than a client.
Oh, very much so. The client's pushing you for a different reason. Right? He's pushing you to get the job done cheaply, right? And all of those things that you're trying to operate against. So.
Yeah. Well, the only thing I'll say is an artist I worked with who's trained as an architect once said to me that the difference for him between calling himself an artist and a designer is that as an artist, he gets to define the problem to be solved. And then he gets to solve it.
That's interesting.
So that's where the control
Yeah.
shifts. So I wanted to open it up to questions. I'm sure there are many for Walter.
And we do have a microphone, so if you could raise your hand, we'll come around so everyone can hear the question.
Bridget.
My name is Bridget Obikoya, and thank you so much for coming to talk to us. It's been a great presentation. I have to say I do live in Arlington, and I love the Knock community. My son goes to school in Knock. I live very close to Knock, and it's a place that I really feel at home in when I'm there, even the town square. So when I found out that you were coming you were commissioned to come and do something here, I was just so elated. I was very happy.
Thank you. I was scared there for a minute.
No. No. It's because your work to me, it seems to have this rhythmic ordering principle in all of the things that I saw, the undulating curves, the rectangular blocks. You even drew inspiration from the transverse lines in the parking lot. And it's just in everything that you do, it seemed to me. And it evokes this deep sense of belonging, or when I see it, I just feel like it's just supposed to be that way. So I'm wondering, do you really get that archetypal imagery when you are into your work, or is it just something that comes from the universe? I don't know, but I'm very inspired by your work.
Well, thank you. I hope that's recorded. I like that. As one of my architecture professors once called me, I'm such a rationalist, right? I begin every project, I want to know what the rules are, right? Every project. And then I can go about breaking them, right? But they have to be very kind of clear. And I think in all the projects that we work on, there is that kind of mantra, right? To really understand what we're doing. And it's hard from project to project because I'm always trying to find the thing that most people can't see, but if you go into it that way, you're not going to see it yourself. So in a way, you have to experience places. You have to be open to those experiences. We're working in Philadelphia right now. I'm actually going to Pearl Street this weekend. And it really has taken, like 4 days before we're going there for me to really get my head around this place because I've just been living with it. And I think that's the most important aspect of the work, is that just because you're making a presentation at this point, you still can live with it, right? And to me, those epiphanies or those things that are really important actually don't happen where you think they're going to happen. They actually happen somewhere else, but you have to be open to them. And so, again, I think the work, every project starts with something very, very clear, very rational, and then the strangeness can actually come out of something else, something coming in from the side, not from that linear relationship. I look forward to working with you out there, particularly, I mean, people who live in a place. I mean, we were talking to some of the gentlemen out there, and just some of the things that people say. If you're receptive, it becomes so inspirational. And talking to the 7 people there, I mean, I have lots of ideas because just of the things that they were saying. I mean, I'm really intrigued by this notion of banning, you know? Because, I mean, there was an argument in the park about banning, right? And the one guy goes, well, if you're banned, I'm sure there's a really good reason why you're banned. And then the other guy goes, well, I don't think anyone should be banned. But it was this value thing going on. And to have normal people have that conversation in this space, to me, is emblematic of what that space can be, right? Where we don't have a lot of spaces where you can have those kinds of conversations. So, thank you.
Cecilia? Promise I won't just call on people I know.
My name is Cecilia Cassidy. I also live in the Nork neighborhood. And I'm glad that you spoke first, because my question was going to be how you engage with the community. It's a community that was an all African American community that has been really gentrified and surrounded now by new $1 million townhomes that took the place of cooperative housing that had been there for many, many years. And John Robinson, who essentially lived in the community center, was essentially homeless. I mean, he lived in the community center. And he was a fixture in the community and a reminder of what that neighborhood had been when South Arlington was essentially segregated, officially segregated, and Washington was too. Very famous performers who were not allowed to stay in Washington, D.C. hotels would stay in the homes of people in that community. So, you know, it's moving away. You know, every street surrounding that neighborhood is homes are being knocked down and replaced by $1 million homes. So essentially my question was, how are you going to capture that and engage, you know, with those guys in the park? Because they've been there for a long, long time. So it's just a follow-up to this other lady's question.
Okay. Well, I mean, just, I can't answer, you know, the whole thing, but one thing I am wary of within the project is the project at this point is about making a landscape. And there's so much making a landscape can do, right, in any place. Places are made up of multidimensional sort of things that go on to sort of create culture. I understand that about landscape. I know landscape can't do certain things. But the thing that we're really interested in is what can landscape do, right? And maybe if it can reveal some of those stories in a very prophetic way, I think it can add to the conversation. But it gets back to this, this question of what is the project, right? And my understanding is it's ambiguous at this point. So just hearing the comments, it begins to suggest that the way we define place might not be where we think we're defining place. Place might be defined in a completely other way that could then serve as a linchpin to deal with and tell some of those stories that we're talking about. Just really quick, when I was in school, I worked for Professor Randy Hester, fantastic professor, mentor. And I was working with him up in the Pacific Northwest in this town called Castle Rock. And as a student, you know, I'm just making drawings, and he's doing his thing, and he's this great community facilitator. And one day we're sitting out on the dike because we were redesigning the river after Mount St. Helens had put all of its ash in the river, and we had been hired to do a riverfront plan. And we were up there all summer doing a riverfront plan. Every afternoon we'd sit and do sketches, and he looked at me, he goes, "Walter, I don't think we should do a riverfront." And I'm looking at him like, "What? You know, I mean, this is all about the river." He goes, "Nope. These people need a place to tell their stories." And he then started telling me that every place we went, people would say, "Hi, I'm John. At 10 o'clock in the morning, I was in my kitchen having coffee, and the mountain blew." And you would hear that from everybody. So he sent me out to find a building. I found an old gas station. We designed the old gas station, and now it's a visitor center. And for the 10th anniversary of Mount St. Helens, people came through and they told their stories. And I think the riverfront is still ash. but it's this idea that being able, right, to sort of hear those voices. And that was one of the things that he instilled in me and seeing through his work, which I think sometimes if we're listening, it propels us to go in different directions. So I do think it's possible. We just have to be brave, right?
Yes.
Yes, my name is Kelly Cook, and I don't live in Virginia. I do teach at the University of Maryland, though. And I have essentially two questions for you, and they're really about the theory that you come to design with. And the first is this idea of taking these types and trying to essentially blow them up and to try to really battle perceptions of what things like parks or trails are. And so the first question is, if you're doing that, by fighting so much against those terms, do you accidentally wind up reinforcing in people's minds what a park is, when in fact a park is not just a passive greensward with trees. You know, parks have multiple years worth of history, centuries. They've been, you know, asymmetrical, informal, rambling spaces. They've been highly formalized spaces. They've been public and private, and they've had, you know, all sorts of scandals take place in them over periods of time. So there is no one park. There is no one trail. And so do you wind up reinforcing those terms while also losing the chance to really explore to greater depth what a park truly can be? And then the second question, if that wasn't a big enough one, if that one wasn't big enough. So you have these types then, but then you did suggest, while the types are malleable, that there is something such as place, whether it's as grand as Jackson Hole or as marshy and sweaty as Washington, D.C. And so that seems to be something that's not shifting and not changing, and yet they are, and they will, whether it's through climate change or geological change or economic change or the way that people just perceive them. So how do you reconcile that desire to shift the types while overlaying that on an object?
Right. Well, let me go back to the presentation. I was in time in a linear frame. The ones I was calling unconscious are probably between 2000 and now, and the more typological are like 1990 to 2000. So they're not this diametrically opposed, and I'm working in both ways. In a way, I'm speaking kind of towards the transformation of the work and the critique at the time. The idea that the park or the typology stays the same, yes, but I was more interested in its cultural relevancy, that people had already created this hybrid language for it, and it wasn't being recognized in the city's revitalization. So Lafayette Square Park, it had that name. People started calling it that. But it was, the square was going to be lost because people were going to approach it in the redesign in the single parkway. And I was more interested in that kind of the cultural transformation. Well, when did people start calling it a park? And then could I reinforce that? And in both of those projects, those things were reinforced. So I was more interested and less interested in that people would still call it a park, but really trying to understand how it became, which there was very little conversation about that other than let's put the historic plaque in the park, right? And so if you go to Lafayette Square, you still walk like that, which is something that I didn't want to change that. That you still walk like that. It just doesn't look that way. You move in a completely other way. And I guess I'm more interested in that transformation, that kind of physical transformation. And we can talk later about the whole park issue, where, you know, park goes from being something, that's at a scale that says something about cities, to park being something so small that it can't have that effect. And again, that's kind of in the background. But these are hard issues to deal with because, as you're saying, they're constantly shifting. But if I could be simple, I think the work has moved from typological space to landscape space. I guess saying it clear, that I'm not interested in the typology anymore, where I did spend a long time trying to shift and move, the profession and people working to look at the type. And in every instance where I've tried to engage our profession in that, people aren't interested. Architecture had this great battle over typology. In landscape, people just weren't interested, or I don't find them that compelled to want to critique it, in the same way.
Thank you. I think I'm going to stand away from the air conditioner while I ask this question. I'm Tindani, and first of all, let me say, as an artist and designer, I respect you as an artist and designer, and I admire you. But my question is more about your personal value into the work. I noticed that it seems as if you have an uncommon level of cultural competency. What I mean by that is, I'm a native Washingtonian, and this is a very transient city. So a lot of people, they travel here and they're not from here. So, people bring culture, but sometimes people don't learn and they don't respect, the culture that's here. On top of that, I live in Ward 8, you know what I mean? So I'm on the poor side of the river in a community that's experiencing aggressive revitalization or gentrification, or whatever you call it. And a lot of, consultants and people, they come to do studies and they come to do things in this neighborhood, but they don't value the culture that exists already. And in your work, I've seen that you've traveled to diverse places and have worked with diverse people and communities in order to accomplish your goals. And how does your value, to understand people's culture and develop a respect for that culture before trying to impose upon it or even try to act like you know what it really is or how to really, help those people? How does that value influence your work?
That's a great question.
Excellent.
My God, man. First, I'm a Southerner. I'm one of those people who moved from North Carolina up here, right? I do think that comes out in the work. I didn't know. I was lecturing in Mexico City a couple years ago, and this guy comes up to me after and goes, "You're a great storyteller." And I hadn't thought of telling stories about the work when I'm around people, but that's something that my father told stories, when you meet people, they tell stories. And so that's one part of it. But the part you're talking about is it's really, you just have to be honest with yourself. And I would tell this story, I'm sure Claire won't mind. Claire Cooper Marcus, who's like one of my most inspirational person to me very early in my career at Berkeley. She's a social scientist. Her big book is Housing, If People Mattered. But she basically pushed architecture to do post-occupancy evaluations, right? But she and I had a project together, my first project, and it was in a housing project, all African American. I was doing the landscape, and she was doing the kind of the programming. And I thought I was okay of starting my office. We go in there, and I got all my Lynchian maps, node, question mark, ambiguity, all of my stuff, right? And we're presenting. And I'm looking in the audience, and these ladies, I see a lot of this. And this woman stood up, and she just said, "Excuse me, stop." And she said, "How dare you? How dare you guys come in here telling us you know us?" And we were doing it through this very prescriptive mapping that we normally do. And she went on to say, "Shame on you. You come in here with your ideas and you say, we don't know each other. My mother's lived here all her life. Her grandmother moved here. We've been here 3 generations. I can take you around to every door, knock on it, and tell you who lives there, their kids." And she just goes on, and I'm sitting there, oh my God. And at that point, I think I wrote a piece about stripping naked when you go into a community and not bringing your values in. Because it's so easy if you come in through that lens, right, to see people. And that was the first time I was confronted by that. And I try now to come into a project, I don't have any preconceived notions of the people. And you could be green, blue, yellow, or orange, or whatever. You know, I'm interested in that place. That's why I'm here. And it's a very hard thing to do because we're filled from school to practice with a lot of these images. And sometimes it's really hard to let them go and actually see things real. And we're constantly trying to do that, and you have to find different ways to do it. You know, we used to do the thing of, okay, arrive to the project by train, right? Arrive by car, walk to it, right? I mean, you'll see the place differently. You know, if people come to my studio in their car, where I work now, they have a completely different view of that neighborhood than people who ride the bus. You know, and the ones who ride the bus, you know, they're texting their mom, and their mom is like, "You're really working in that neighborhood, right?" The ones in the car, they don't even mention it, right? And so, again, it's how you come to the work. So, you know, you constantly try to put yourself in check to make sure, you know, that you're seeing people clearly. But it's a really hard thing to do because our whole society, there are things out there that force us to kind of look at certain people a certain way and to reinforce those stereotypes. And it's just a really hard thing to do.
I will say one hopeful thing. I have seen this happen on a number of occasions when we bring the right artist in, and I do get the role of playing curator in our program. So we have had artists come in from the outside into a community, be open, like you say, and have been able to get the community to reveal things that really they hadn't quite put together for themselves. You know, it's almost like a therapist or something.
Yeah.
You know, somebody from the outside who can really hold up the mirror and say, you know, look at yourselves. Let me help you look at yourselves. I will say what we did in the intervening time between 2006 when the county worked with NOC to develop a kind of a framework for what they wanted this town square to be, and now when we're joining the project, we began an oral history project where we hired a folklorist to come in because we knew there were people dying in the community. There were people who were moving away, and we wanted to make sure that this got captured in some way. And so it was a bit of a stopgap measure. We wanted to continue the community process, but we also didn't want to lose too much of this good information until we had Walter come to then help, you know, create a built environment that could somehow reflect all of this. But I will say I've seen miraculous things happen when you bring an artist in to work with a community. And it's not impositional. It's really can be quite revelatory.
But it's also, there's a neighborhood, I presented in a neighborhood for a project here, and I tried to speak the truth. People didn't want to hear the truth. Sometimes people don't want to hear the truth. Well, they want it to be a certain way, you know, and you can speak the truth all day, but if you have that image of where you're trying to get to, you know, I mean, how can you walk through a neighborhood, right? Someone's playing Maggot Brain on a guitar, right? And then do new urbanism. You know, I'm just saying, it's just this kind of, you know, disconnect. And what I mean by that is to not see that. And I don't mean anything about new urbanism, but to take something that's already fixed and to see, you know, something that rich in a place, which the neighborhoods, you know, neighborhoods are just these rich places, which force you, right, to change what's in your pocket, right? I mean, it should force you, but sometimes it does, sometimes it doesn't. Okay.
I'm afraid we've come to the end of our time together. Walter and Angela, thank you very much, both of you, for a terrific program. Thank you.